Japan is disappearing before our very eyes. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to talk about Japan, one of the most fascinating countries in the entire history of the world, and yet today is faced with existential challenges, the likes of which I do not see a way through. Japan has a rich history. In fact, it has the oldest continuous monarchy in the world. I think the same family has ruled over Japan around 600 BC. Of course, it famously resisted those Mongol invasions and then led into the feudal Japan era with all those daimyo, incredible characters like Oda Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, Hideyori, Keito Kayamasa, Konishi Yuganaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu, capturing the imagination of the samurai and the ronin and the ninja. But then it went through a transformation known as the Meiji Restoration. And this is a critical marker, not only in Japanese history, but I think also understanding the Japanese soul. Japan's cultural influences had been imported from other places, so Confucianism, Buddhism, and the like, and Japan would take those elements and wear them lightly. They would take those things that they thought were useful, that made sense to them, and they would just disregard other things. Well, when the colonial powers showed up with their rifles and steamships and modern technology, the likes of which none had ever imagined, the superiority, the technical superiority, but also some of the institutional advantages of Western powers were very attractive to the Japanese. And they realized uniquely that they needed to adapt very quickly in order to survive in a competitive colonial era. If we compare that to what happened with China, China could not imagine a world in which they were not the culturally superior nation that everyone sought to emulate. This notion that they had to adapt things from other places was just beyond their comprehension. And they were ultimately carved up among various colonial powers. And it wasn't until Deng Xiaoping came to power in the late 1970s that he started to see the advantages of the Western traditions and opened up the economy. And that's why we have things like communism with Chinese characteristics. They have gone through their restoration 100 years after Japan did. The Japanese adapted all those things early on and never suffered those indignities that the Chinese did during that century of humiliation. That led to the modernization of their military. And then in 1905, 1906, you had the Japanese-Russian War, a watershed moment in European history. It was the first time a European colonial power had been defeated by an Asian power. In fact, the first time any European power had really been defeated since the Mongol invasions. And yet, even though Russia was sort of perceived as a little bit backward, it really did wake up the rest of the world to this emerging Japanese expansionism. And then Japan became a colonial power itself, expanded into northern China, invaded Korea, and then, of course, most famously and fatally in the end, bombed Pearl Harbor and took over much of Asia, only to be thoroughly discouraged and defeated by the United States. But then again, after the defeat, and we have to think about the scale of the destruction here, 50 Japanese cities were destroyed through firebombing. That's not even including the 2 destroyed by atomic bombs. And yet, after the defeat, the reconstruction was amazing. It was rapid, the industrialization complete, the high technology reached for extremely quickly, and the standards of living becoming a first world powerhouse well into the 1970s. And then by the 1980s, many were even saying that Japan would become the world's greatest economy. That was never likely in retrospect because it was that they had a population less than half that of the United States. It's hard to see how they would be that productive. But in the early 90s, a lot of people believed that. And we saw a lot of Japanese bashing in Hollywood. We saw the movie The Rising Sun, which basically treated Japan's rise with a degree of fear in the United States. And yet at that point, at that very marker, Japan then experienced a full decade of economic malaise. They were hit badly by the Asian financial crisis, and also they had a liquidity gap. You could not get Japanese people to spend in an economic downturn, no matter what you did with interest rates, reinforced by cultural norms that they would all save, the economy would contract. And now we have what is a total catastrophe, which is their demography. Japan is the oldest society in the world. I think the average or median age is 47 or 48. The birth rate is 1.2 or 1.3, and yet they have almost no immigration. Japan is the most homogenous society in the entire history of the world. 99% of the population is Yamato Japanese. There is a high degree of distrust and antipathy towards immigration. That's one of the reasons fueling the robot kind of revolution in Japan, to try and find a way to augment the economy with automation and other support devices without relying on human capital. And yet that is only going to be a partial success. Okay, you have right now in Japan more people buying adult diapers than children's diapers. The population, the face of Japan, is skewing highly older to retiree age, wherein people are relying on government services with a shrinking tax base and a shrinking economy. Add to that two more things that just make this a perfect storm. First, Japan's relations with its neighbors. It has a historical animosity with Korea, with China, these major powers in the region that they can't escape. They're absolutely dependent on their relationship with the United States and their alliance in order to preserve their national sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of a rapidly rising China that has never forgiven them for the colonial period, and neither have the Koreans. And Japan has not been successful in being able to reconcile with those places, and they maintain significant territorial disputes in the East China Sea, and then they've actually lost territory to Russia. The Kurili Islands were never returned after they're being seized in the dying days of World War II. On top of that, you have high technology competition. Japan and Australia had this long-standing trade relationship. In fact, during those 80s and 90s, Japan was Australia's #1 trading partner. We built a massive embassy in the middle of downtown Tokyo. It is just a testament to monstrosity and grandiosity of government presence. And I've been to our embassy in Tokyo. I think we spent about $700 million in 90s money on this one building, thinking that the Japan relationship was going to be our most important in perpetuity. Well, in a very short period of time, with the rise of China, China has vastly exceeded Japan as Australia's #1 trading partner. Japan getting, I think, now third or something like that. And a lot of the trade is on the same products. So the days of us, shipping a bunch of ore over to Japan, them turning it into a car, selling it back to us, well, that's now happening in China, that's happening in Korea, that's happening in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. These countries are developing high technology industries which are diluting Japan's technological and economic advantages, right? So their entire industries are suffering, as well as a shrinking workforce. And on top of that, Japan has the highest government debt on earth. Prior to the pandemic, I think it was like 240% of GDP. That's now pushing up to 300%, something like that. By comparison, Australia's debt to GDP after the pandemic, like right now, is only about 70% of GDP. So that means that with a shrinking tax base and an aging population requiring a lot of government services, a dependency on the United States, and also a lot of pressure to increase defense expenditure and competition for its high technology industries, it has to service a massive debt, meaning that the government can't invest in expanding these industries. It's just an enormous perfect storm, and Japan is circling the drain as a result. The only possible way out, and it's an imperfect solution as far as I can see, is to massively increase immigration. That would not be hard from a technical point of view. I remember being in Manila, one of the few places that actually sends people to Japan as medical staff who are Filipino working in hospitals and aged care facilities and things like that. They line up around the block for those Japanese visas, high incomes, good standard of living, and the Japanese importing those people because they're absolutely necessary to support this aging population. But that's always on a sort of limited basis, and to permanently relocate to Japan is incredibly hard. The Japanese, on a psychological level, are very anti-immigration, and therefore it is unlikely that they're going to import large numbers of working age people to settle permanently in Japan, to create families and expand the population and create new sort of tax wealth. That's just unlikely to happen. I think they should consider it though, because the consequences of not doing that are just sending Japan over a cliff. I would love to hear from the Japanese as to what I've said here, because the picture that I've painted is one that's very dark and very worrying, but these are immediate challenges that the Japanese have to contend with. I don't think they can afford to drift another 2 decades, by which time a huge proportion of the population will be well over 65, well over retirement age. Very few people able to provide the services needed for those people to live a comfortable retirement in their older years, and faced with the enormous existential challenges to their industries and to their national sovereignty of emerging regional powers. I would love to hear different points of view on this, but I just want to raise the alarm here because it's an incredible country. It's still a significant power, and it really needs to address this. Otherwise, the entire West, I mean, it's an incredible country for the Western alliances. It's certainly the United States' most important ally in East Asia. I mean, Australia is culturally significant for the United States and strategically important there at the bottom of the Malacca Straits. But right there next to China, Japan is definitely the most important ally for the United States, and also the most committed, because they're fully aware of the antipathy that the Chinese have for them. Having said that, hopefully you've found value in this discussion, and if you have a different view or you support what I'm saying, please leave a comment down below. What do you think should happen with Japan to make them kind of go through a national revival? They have demonstrated time and again through the Meiji Restoration and the post-World War construction that they are capable of doing that. So I don't deny their enormous ingenuity. If anyone can do it, it's the Japanese. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps grow the channel. And I will see you next time. Thank you.